Well, I'm here with John Robb and his son, and we're here to talk about some very exciting things that God has done, and we get to hear what God's story is about. John, tell us.
It's hard to tell the difference because we're both John Robb, but I'm the original. He's just a copy. Skip, thank you for asking us to come and do this. And this is a story, this is God's story. It's a story about God, in answer to prayer, saved what are estimated to be 2 million people from a faraway country that were going to die. And when all efforts to help them had failed, and everything human beings could do had been done, but it didn't work. And these people were going to be intentionally permitted to starve by a government that had taken over Cambodia. Cambodia is in Southeast Asia. It's a small country. It had been very much victimized by the Pol Pot regime, where the people had been starved, and the Vietnamese had taken control. And this is a story about how God saved them. And he did it in answer to prayer. And the interesting thing was that most of the major prayer efforts came right here from Albuquerque. And it was a result of prayer in the Albuquerque churches. And there were Albuquerque people who were involved in the effort to get it going. And never in the world did we think we were going to start a national effort. But that's what happened. And we were the least qualified to do it, but God made it happen. And the wonderful thing about that was that he used both prayer and efforts by people, including Josh McDowell, who came and put it all together when it looked like the effort was going to fail. And that story is really terrific. And it was 31 years ago, but you know, it has relevance today. There are problems in the world today that are comparable to that. And so it's a lesson we can all learn, and we can apply it today. So it's not just ancient history. And then we want to tell that story. We want to tell God's story. We want to tell what the follow-up was from that, what the results were, what God did, and how it happened. And if you permit me, let me start with how it happened.
Please.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to John, my son, because he was with me from the beginning, and he was there at the end, and I covered the bases in between.
Excellent.
Yeah, it was August of 1979. I had been a missionary in Southeast Asia, came home on furlough, and Dad and I were visiting in our family home here in Albuquerque, and we were having a bowl of ice cream together, turned into the news.
We still do that, yeah.
Too much. And we were watching the news, and it was talking about Cambodia and the fact that 2 million could die because the Vietnamese installed government was not allowing relief shipments up into the hinterland because they did not want the Khmer Rouge to get the food. So they were willing to allow many, many people to die. And as we sat there with our ice cream, we just were convicted of the need to do something. That we had to pray, but we had also to contact public officials and do all we could. That led to our driving over to Gallup to meet with Senator Pete Domenici, the New Mexico senator, and he gave Dad some advice about going back to Washington, D.C., contacting the U.S. State Department, etc., and that's how it all began. But Dad really carried the ball. I went on to do some studies out in California, and he was the one who really picked it up with others and began to carry it at that point. And then I came back into the story later. So Dad, over to you again.
Well, Pete Domenici was interested in this, and the day before we went to Gallup, an article appeared in the Albuquerque Journal. It was a national story that was originated in the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post. And it told a story about the desperate situation. And I asked myself, how could this be happening? I hadn't heard anything about this until this TV program and the article in the paper. Where have I been? I've been asleep this whole time. How could I be sitting and doing nothing, and how could American Christians be doing nothing? And so I could not understand. I thought there was no credibility to the story. It couldn't be right. But they were quoting groups that you couldn't deny. They were quoting the International Red Cross. They were quoting World Vision. They were quoting the State Department. They were quoting all these sources. And so I couldn't deny the fact that something real was happening. And that when I checked around, I couldn't see that anybody that I knew about was doing anything about it. And so somehow we felt called to do something. And I called Max Leach. He's from Albuquerque. And we decided to set up an organization called Christians in Cambodia. It was designed to be a national organization that was going to go through prayer and activity to try to see if the thing could be changed. And that included an idea to go to the United Nations and try to persuade the Vietnamese to change their minds, and also to try to get the Soviets to change their minds, because the Soviet Union was supporting them. And so we began contacting churches in Albuquerque and asking them to start to pray. That started in early September. And we continued our prayer efforts. And what happened next was that Pete told me that he had an appointment set up with the State Department. And so I went to Washington and I met with the Assistant Secretary of State. And I expected him to say, well, there are a lot of things we can do and maybe we don't need you. The contrary was true. They said, we have done everything. We have known about this situation for 3 months. We have tried to get them, we've leaned on them, but the Cold War was on. They had no influence at all over the Soviet Union that was influencing the whole thing. And the result was they said, you ought to do what you're thinking of doing. You need to go to the United Nations. That's our only hope. Give some publicity to this thing internationally. You need to get pressure on both the Vietnamese and the Soviet. And so we then began to plan something in the United Nations. So we got organized. We had an organizer on the East Coast, the West Coast, the Midwest. But I wasn't skilled in doing that sort of thing. And I didn't follow up, and the bottom line was it fell apart. The attempt to get Christians all over the country to do it. And I went to Washington a second time on October 14th. And that time they had Warren Christopher, the Deputy Secretary of State, met with us. And that said to me, this was a matter of some importance to the government to try to do something. And he said the same thing. I thought maybe the situation had changed. It had not changed. He said, you need to do this. And we can't do anything. But if you'll go and get Christians organized, we'll do it. So I go back to Albuquerque and I find out what's going on and these people that we had lined up, and virtually nothing was happening. And I said, Lord, how can that be? You really called us to do this, and yet nothing is happening nationally. What can we do? And I picked up the paper and it said, Josh McDowell is coming to town tomorrow. I didn't know Josh McDowell, but I knew of his reputation. I'd read evidence that demands a verdict. I'd been impressed by it. I'm impressed by him. So I found out where he was staying. I go to his hotel room. I knock on the door. He opens it. I introduce myself. He doesn't know me from Adam. His son is there. He and his son are watching TV. So I said, can I come in? I want to tell you a story. And I told him what was in our heart. I told him what was happening there. And I expected him to say, well, you know, I'm too busy. I got too much going on. And he had a very busy schedule. You know what he said? He said, I was in El Paso last night, and I heard the first story on TV that I'd ever heard about that. And I said, Lord, if there's anything that I can do, I'll do it. God had already prepared him. I didn't have to sell him a bill of goods. God had already told him that he was to do something. And you know what he said? What are you doing Saturday morning? Nothing. I'm going to get on the telephone, a conference call with all the project directors of Campus Crusade in the eastern part of the United States, and we're going to tell them the story and see if they want to get involved. And I thought, well, you know, they don't know anything about Cambodia, and they've got their own things to do. That probably won't do any good. But by golly, he got them mobilized, and they got interested, and they turned out to be the core of the people that came to New York with the United Nations. And so what we did then was we really worked with the Albuquerque churches. They had started praying in early September, and they kept on the prayer efforts. And then on the 10th of November, just 2 days before we went to New York, there was a huge rally at the First Presbyterian Church, and the churches sent representatives, and we had a huge citywide prayer effort. Virtually all the churches that we know of, at least, got involved in praying for the people of Cambodia. And that made a difference. Things began to happen. Things had started before then, but there had not been real efforts. They had been token efforts by the Vietnamese government that made people think that was okay, and they said they would not oppose it, but they had opposed it right up until then. So we then got arrangements in New York. In that October meeting, when I had met with Warren Christopher, I then went to New York, and I talked to a New York lawyer, and I said, how do we do this? We want to have a rally before the United Nations. We want to split up into 2 delegations and send one to the Vietnamese embassy and the other one to the Soviet embassy, and we want to present petitions that Josh says he's going to get. And I thought, you know, he might get 500 or 1,000 or something like that. I'm going to let Donnie tell you the surprise that we found when we got to New York on November 12th. That was the big day before the United Nations. Donnie, you tell them how we met with Richard Holbrooke.
Yeah, we started off with a visit to the U.S. mission to the United Nations, and out came Richard Holbrooke, who has become very famous as a diplomat in the Bosnia War and now in Afghanistan. And he gave us some advice about how we should go about it. And then we went over and we had a demonstration with about 500 Christian folks that came from Campus Crusade, most of them students. Josh McDowell was there. I think the husband and wife who led Campus Crusade in Cambodia, who had to escape with their lives running across the countryside from the Khmer Rouge. I think they described eating rats to survive and their ordeal. But we met there at about a block from the UN at the Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza and heard different speakers, and then we all went marching on the streets of New York with the New York police running interference. We went to the Vietnam embassy, to the Russian embassy, and dumped off 80,000 signatures that Josh McDowell and his colleagues had gathered.
That he had accumulated in less than 2 weeks. I mean, it's a miracle. Only God could have worked that.
And it obviously had an impact both on the Vietnamese and the Russians. Afterwards, and this is an example of how the Lord goes before you and gives favor in such situations, but we ended up inside the UN Secretariat with the United Nations reporters asking questions, especially of Dad and Josh McDowell and the 2 Cambodian Campus Crusade leaders. And it was so impressive. I was standing in the back just thinking, wow, Lord, you really did this. This is a marvelous thing to be right there in the heart of the UN. And of course that public attention was something the Vietnamese were uncomfortable with, and the Russians. And this kind of thing, the prayer plus the advocacy, the action, really resulted in a turnaround. And so we began to see the headlines change. And they were allowing the shipments of food to get in, both from the border of Thailand and then up from Phnom Penh to the north, where the people were starving. Want to add anything more there?
Yes, I think the interesting thing was we had to get 12 permits. 12 permits to exercise our constitutional rights to demonstrate before the United Nations. The fire department, the police department, the social working, the whole works. And I had a New York lawyer, a Christian lawyer, who was very helpful, and he got all that for us. And so everything, as he said, we had God's favor the whole time. Everything went before us. Everything happened. It looked like it was an utter failure, but God used Josh to bring it all together.
And then what was the response when you provided those signatures? How quick was the turnaround? How quick was the response?
I think within a matter of a couple of weeks, we saw that there was a change in the atmosphere as far as the attitude of the Vietnamese backed regime, the Heng Samrin regime in Phnom Penh, to allowing the relief shipments. The Red Cross have been having a hard time. The UN, HCR, people had a hard time. But there was much greater cooperation, and there was a flow of food supplies in so the people could live. Just to follow up to this too, is that it demonstrated to me the power of prayer. Being a missionary activist, I believed in prayer, but I saw it before my eyes. And later on, I was with World Vision, and I ended up directing the prayer ministries of World Vision internationally. And I remembered this experience in Cambodia. And in 1994-95, we got involved in another prayer initiative inside Cambodia with Cambodian Christian leaders. The Khmer Rouge were still coming out of the jungles where they had been driven by the Vietnamese, and they were murdering whole villages. And so the Christian leaders said, can we mobilize prayer? We're in a spiritual warfare for the well-being of the nation. And I said, well, I've never really done too much of that, but I did remember this episode. And we began to get prayer networks to pray. And it was November 1994, and the first prayer request was, pray for the dissolving of the Khmer Rouge. By February 1995, February 7th, front page New York Times said, "The Khmer Rouge are dissolving."
Oh my.
Thousands of believers had prayed internationally for this to happen. We saw it before our eyes, and I said, wow, God, you're really there after all, and you really do care, and you really will answer prayer. And so it kind of converted me from being just a pure Martha activist into more of a Mary listener to Jesus and pray to him. And it shifted me from just mission work to prayer plus action. Beautiful. Action flowing out of prayer over those years. And so then the Cambodian Christian leaders invited me to take a team. I brought 10 other prayer leaders. We went into Phnom Penh. This was March, April of 1995. And we had a prayer conference. Started as a conference would. First day was very normal. But one of our team during the night heard the Lord speak to him. And he got up the next day and he said only one sentence that changed the history of the Church of Cambodia and indeed the nation. And he said, some of you, speaking to these Christian leaders, some of you have blood on your hands. And we heard this wailing began to develop and crying out because 20 of the 60 had killed with their own hands in the killing fields. And we had, I think it was 3 former Khmer Rouge executioners in the group that had killed thousands. And they had then come to know the Lord in the refugee camps, become pastors, but they'd never confessed this because of fear of retaliation. So we had to have a room where they could go and pour out the most heinous atrocities you can ever imagine, things that they had done. And they had repressed it, and it was on their consciences. And it was such a tremendous relief that they were then able to form a national Christian fellowship in the months after, and there was a new unity. And so the Lord brought healing to relationships through this, and the church began to explode, we later heard. And there was just an immense church growth. There were signs and wonders happening, healings and miracles, casting out of demons. And thousands upon thousands came to the Lord. The church grew 40 times in size, from 10,000 to 400,000 in the next several years. And so something happened spiritually. And one of the high points of that prayer initiative I wanted to say was that we went up with 7 of these pastors to the place where the original God King of the Cambodians invited in a demonic force called Naga, the serpent god, and Shiva, the god of destruction, to become the gods of Cambodia. From that time, at about the 9th century, there was blood shedding all the time. Khmer Rouge were the latest version of it. But these 7 pastors took us to that very place where that God King stood when he made the invocation to the evil one. And they laid out a snakeskin, they put their feet on it, and they said, we are taking back our country for Jesus Christ. And the breakthrough happened then. And there was such great joy that people just started to dance. And the little children came out of nowhere. And we don't even know if they were Christians, but they wanted to join in it. And we prayed for the children, that they would not have that same kind of idolatry and bloodshed and harm that their parents had experienced. So anyway, it was quite a time. And I just think, and my father agrees, that prayer is so important. Prayer opens the way, and then God guides us to show us what our actions should be, which is the apostolic way, you know. Acts 13, the apostles prayed, they listened to God, and then he said, I want you to do this for me. And often we get it the other way around. We start to act, and then we say, oh God, would you please bless what we're going to do, you know? And so I think both instances, what Dad did with the Christians for Cambodia, and then later on this prayer initiative for the same country, we see that principle demonstrated.
Donnie, you've gone all over the world. You've ministered in more than 100 countries. You've seen what's going on in many, many situations. Why is what happened 31 years ago relevant to today?
Because there are similar holocausts going on around the world, even as we speak, like North Korea. Right now, I'm involved with many of my colleagues in the International Prayer Council in a prayer initiative for North Korea. 8 million people have died there since that regime took over, with Kim Il-sung, the communist leader, and now his son, Kim Jong-il. And they are willing to let people starve to death. There are hundreds of thousands of children that have nothing to eat. They're wandering the streets. They're dying of starvation, even as we speak. And this government has established huge prison camps. There's 200,000 people in prison camps. Many of them are political prisoners. Many of them are Christians. If you're a Christian in North Korea, it's a death sentence, pretty much. And so this is the worst persecutor of Christians. It's the most, in my opinion, the most evil area on the face of the earth right now. And it seems like humanly there's very little we can do from the outside, but we can pray. And we believe, the Koreans that are my colleagues and others, believe that there's going to be a liberation of North Korea as people around the world pray. So this year, going into next year, is a special international prayer initiative for the liberation of North Korea. And we believe the Lord is going to do the same kind of thing that he did in Cambodia with that very needy country. And that out of this, there'll be a reintegration of the Korean Peninsula, no longer divided by the DMZ as it is today, but North and South Korea as one nation.
Give me a sense of timing, going back 31 years to that night when you had your ice cream and you first heard about it until you saw those tables turn.
This would have been the end of August until November. So it was several months.
But if you just, I mean, to cast it in that light, just a few months later, through a couple of believers saying, we've got to do something, and by God's grace we will, and to see a nation turn in its policy, that's magnificent.
Well, it's truly the hand of God, because we had no experience in this area. We were just here in little old Albuquerque, but we just felt a sense of burden and concern. And that's where it begins. I think God, he puts these burdens on our hearts, and we need to follow, even though it looks like it's impossible and that we don't have the resources, we don't have the expertise in ourselves. But as somebody said, God plus one is always a majority with one human being. God and that person or two people can be very, very potent in any situation. And I like Matthew 18, where Jesus said, if even two of you agree as touching anything you're asking of the Father, it can be done and will be done. And if we hang in there and persist, it's just a very powerful thing. Prayer plus the appropriate action out of prayer. Beautiful.
Beautiful. I love the way you cast that and frame that. Prayer first, then the action. Yes. I think you've already done this, but I'm going to ask you to do one other thing, and just sort of to bring it to the application of, because I don't know all who's going to see it, but the application of the ordinary Christian seeing a need in the world, feeling a burden from the Lord, sensing something needs to be done, seeing an injustice, knowing that they're an ambassador of Christ. What steps, 1, 2, 3, do you think you'd encourage them to take? Kind of give them a game plan of what to do.
Well, I think listening to God is very important. If you look at the book of Exodus, just a little background first. I think it's Exodus 3 to 14. The Lord spoke to Moses 44 times. Moses spoke back to God only 11 times. In other words, we're often in prayer, we do all the talking and we don't listen enough. What is God saying to us? It could be a burden in the heart, it could be a picture in the mind, it could be a scripture that just you can't get off your mind and heart, but that we need to listen more. And when we hear what God's heart is, then we need to start taking action, asking Him to guide, but reaching out to others. who would share the vision. So I think it's receiving the vision through listening, through praying, through reading Scripture, and then acting and believing. As Jesus said, even if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you can command that mountain to move and it will move. And just begin reaching out to others, even a small group. Always a minority, a committed minority, has been instrumental in changing human history. It's not the great masses, it's the committed minority. Start reaching out to a few others, and God will do amazing things. It's like the little boy bringing the loaves and the fish, and Jesus multiplies what little we do. But a lot of times we hold back because we just feel so inadequate. Could we do anything? Could we make a difference? And I think we need to just move ahead with the little we have, with the staff that's in our hand, in the case of Moses, or the loaves and the fish, and just give them to the Lord, make ourselves available, and He will guide us step by step to doing the right thing in that situation.
Yeah, I really second that. I see God selecting the disciples. What authority did they have? What education? What background did they have? Yet they were mighty men of God. They changed the world. Because when God calls you, He enables. He enables. We had nothing experience. We had no national experience doing this. The people who came were mostly students. This was a student movement that came to New York, 500 students that had been recruited because their hearts were turned to do this. They had no experience.
Yeah.
But God did it. He provided Josh McDowell, and Josh put it together.
Yeah. And the Senator Domenici was
Yes.
a big help, and others.
That's right.
And so as you just obey the Lord and move forward, He brings others into it. He brings the resources. But the main thing is we need to start taking those first steps.
Steps. I was going to say, use that word. Take the step.
Yeah, yeah.
Hear from the Lord. Take a step and see what He does with that first step and second step.
Even though it's impossible. Everybody had said nothing can be done. The International Red Cross said that to us. World Vision said that to us. All the agencies that should know better said it's impossible. The Prince of Cambodia had said all our people are going to die. All our people are going to die. Everybody had given up. The State Department had given up. They said there's nothing more we can do. So it was an impossible situation. Only God could make it happen.